All right. So I'm usually not very good with microphones because I basically don't know how to use them, but I can project really well. So if you can't hear me, I will not take offense if you say, speak up a little bit louder. Okay, so before we get started, just to qualify the expert on fear, which kind of sounds like, kind of makes me out to be a terrifying human being. I am a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, just across the river. Now, if you'd got me a year from now, I would have my PhD, and then it would look very impressive, but you don't have me a year from now. I am a graduate student, like I said, in clinical psychology, more on the research side of things. My research centers around how people become afraid of things in general, and how people become afraid of things that are not actually dangerous, but are similar to what is actually dangerous. So the best example of this is, if someone was bit by a Rottweiler, and then they become afraid of Doberman Pinschers and German Shepherds and poodles and things like that. So I kind of do basic fear work like that, in which it has a translational component to anxiety disorders and fear disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. But that's what I do. Let's focus, though, on the topic today, which is not so much in my usual area of clinical psychology, but more broadly, fear and terror. And we're going to go through a little bit and, kind of talk about what exactly that is. So I'm a very big fan of looking at what the dictionary tells us, not because the dictionary is always correct, but because actually a lot of psychology, a lot of scientific psychology has started with a linguistic study, looking at the words that people use, because those inform clearly what we think of the world and how we define it. So thank you, Google. Fear, this is a dicey definition for me, and we'll actually get into why. But in general, we're talking about an unpleasant state, right? And so, okay, you all knew that. You could have Googled something. Why'd you come here? And I'm glad that you guys showed up for me. I know you didn't know The Shining was after, but thank you. So fear, what exactly is this? And we're going to get into why this definition might not be exactly correct, but it's important to know that we do have a kind of dictionary definition. So when moving forward, I think what can be really helpful is to talk about the biology of fear, and I don't want to bog us down in too many neuroscientific details, but I think that can be helpful for answering the question of why people like horror movies. What is fear and how is it related to watching horror movies? So we can talk about the biology, then we can talk about the psychology of it, which I'm a psychologist. This is something near and dear to my heart. And then we can talk a little bit about the sociocultural aspects of fear, and then bring it all together. So let's get into that. So fear basics. This is the least ridiculously convoluted picture of the fear system that you can find. We are scientists. We're really great at doing science. We're not great at making easily understood diagrams. So I apologize for that. But the basics here is that the brain is where fear originates. There was, historically some thoughts that it could be related to bodily humors, but no, the fear originates in the brain. I think this is pretty well understood and well accepted at this point. But in particular, the brain is just the starting point. A lot of what we think of when we think of fear is related to bodily responses, which I'll get into in just a second. But most importantly is this question of, okay, well, where is fear in the brain? And I'm going to ruin the kind of conclusion later on. No one agrees quite yet. There's some consensus. There's definitely some consensus about what's important. And one of those things is the amygdala. This is a bilateral, so on both sides of the brain, a bilateral structure. It's kind of always described as like almond-sized or almond-shaped, kind of buried in the temporal lobes. And the amygdala, actually, I'm curious. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the amygdala, if it's ever been nice. Okay, cool. All right, I'm good. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you later. So the amygdala is established as a fear hub. Also an emotion hub as well, which I'll get into. But the amygdala is kind of this idea, okay, well, it's the fear hub. It's where fear is, or at least it's centrally implicated in fear. Well, yeah, that's true, but it's also thought there's a system of neural networks and certain regions that are also important to what we think of as fear. Two that are highlighted here are the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of the decision-making and kind of higher cognitive aspect of the human brain. And I say that intentionally because a lot of what we know about fear comes from animal models that don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex. So it's important that we're talking about human models of fear versus non-human, and we'll get into that as well. But yeah, so prefrontal cortex, kind of the decision-making aspect, the hippocampus, kind of the memory center of the brain, so to speak, that kind of lets you know what to be afraid of. Your past experiences are there. That Rottweiler that bit you, that's where it lives in the brain. I'm going to be doing a lot of air quotes. I apologize. It's a bad habit. And then the hypothalamus, which is what sends that fear signal to the rest of the body to kind of get you activated. I'm assuming that if you've heard of the amygdala, you've heard of fight or flight. It's that type of response. In fact, detailed on the right of this picture, the hypothalamus going down to the pituitary gland and going down to the adrenal gland, it's what's known as the HPA axis. It releases cortisol. I think this is another thing that's been pretty well kind of disseminated as a scientific finding. But that's basically how your body knows, oh, we got to get out of here. There's a bear chasing us. Let's start running. That's why the common fear response is to have something like sweating, right? You want to drop weight. Heart beating. You got to get blood to the parts of the body that you need to get out of there. You need to get away from that bear. Reproductive functioning shuts down when people are afraid, because clearly, if you're running away from a bear, probably not a lot of time to think about sex. And then, of course, there's this kind of like tension kind of somatic response as well. That comes from the HPA axis as well, getting your muscles ready to run, that type of thing. Now, this is another overly complicated slide that just demonstrates one really nice point. What's unclear about fear is that if the amygdala is fear-specific, these studies on the left, or this is actually a meta-analysis, a study of studies that was reprinted in this review, is showing that so over here, this is basically a percentage of studies that are finding significant amygdala activation based on emotion category. So that means you can basically read this as either perceiving or experiencing. EXP is experiencing, PER is perceiving. You can read this as basically, well, we actually see that, yeah, fear is activated for the amygdala, and it's shown in neural space up there, that red blob. But also for disgust, anger, happiness, and sadness, the amygdala is also activated. So it's not just that the amygdala is a fear center, it's an emotion center, which kind of, gives us some problems in terms of defining fear. We don't even know, or we do know to some extent, but we're not totally sure how fear is distributed in the brain, if fear is a discrete emotion or not. Spoiler, it's probably not. And science can, agree. See, I got my own joke wrong. I can't believe it, and I'm being recorded too. Unclear if science can agree on anything ever, because this is just the nature of what we do. So going from the biology to the psychology, and again, the take-home message on the biology, it's a series of systems. It seems to be somewhat related to the amygdala, but it also seems to be distributed throughout the brain. And, well, that's about the most we can say with any definitive answer on the biological level. Psychologically speaking, it gets even more complicated, because psychologically speaking, we have to talk about fear as one of the human emotions. So most of what we've learned about in terms of fear, like I said, is from animal models. So we have to think about what are the differences between animals and humans, both on a biological level, but on a psychological level as well. Animals, just because they're animals, doesn't necessarily mean they don't have some form of psychological experience. It's just less rich and likely less rich than humans. So we have to take that into account. The other thing is, and that I think goes back to the slide regarding the definition from the dictionary, fear and anxiety are conflated a lot. Neurally, they're actually pretty different. Behaviorally, they look pretty different. And I would argue that evolutionarily, they have very distinct purposes. Humans are the only species to get anxious in the way that scientists define it. Other species can have some discomfort that's related to something, but our ability to kind of see into the future is what defines anxiety, because anxiety could be considered maladaptive. It's something that's in response to a future threat. It hasn't happened yet. Whereas fear, in humans, we still have our fear response. Well, that's pretty helpful, right? You need your fear response at times. Again, if a bear is chasing at you, it's really helpful to have your fear response. So there's those kind of questions as well. But most importantly, and the reason that I have this slide over here, is that there's an interplay between fear and other motivations and goals. I think it's pretty well accepted that one of the things that kind of defines humans or separates it from other mammals, certainly, is the ability to enact goal-directed behavior and to do things with kind of long-term purpose. So fear is just one part of the equation. When we think about fear as humans, it's definitely just one part of the equation, because let's think about it this way. If everyone was afraid and that was just it, and that just got in the way of everything, which is what happens with animals most of the time. You know, they're afraid, they don't do something. They're afraid, they freeze. But if with humans, if it was you're afraid and that's it, no one would be here to see a movie. Stephen King would be out of a job, right? To quickly break this down, though, it's just this diagram over here is just a demonstration of, well, when we talk about fear in humans, it's still complicated in that we don't even agree on what a basic emotion is. Like, that's the state of the field. It's the idea that, all the way on the left is, well, there's discrete emotions. You respond with fear, you respond to something fearfully, and that's it, and it's in the brain. Whereas the farther right you go, it's more of a psychological constructivist approach, in which there's a lot of things that define fear. What other people are doing, your previous experiences with fear, different areas of the brain, and language, right? What you have learned about fear from other people and from your own experiences, and how it's encoded semantically. It's pretty difficult to explain to someone exactly how it is when you are afraid, right? Everyone's slightly different, but we have this universal code word. I was afraid. Oh, I know what you're talking about. So there's maybe this constructivist approach that kind of defines fear more in line with what I'm kind of giving you folks. And really what we're getting at, and I apologize, now we're up to the kind of boring looking slides, is it's these individual differences called individual difference psychology. And it's how, when, and why we experience fear and anxiety, and why we experience them differently. And this is where we're going to be much more into this idea of, this is why maybe some folks want to seek out something like a scary movie, and why some folks don't want to. So like how, right? People have different bodily responses when in response to something that's afraid. Some people, or something that's scary to them. Some people, for example, have none of the shakiness or sweatiness that a lot of people might have when they're afraid. Also, some people are much better at regulating their emotions. Some people are much better at down-regulating their fear than others, which might make them, have the ability to tolerate different things. In terms of when, we know pretty well that conditions of uncertainty, that the more uncertain something is, the better it is able to raise kind of that fear response. But that depends on the person as well, based on a lot of different things. And then, of course, certain stimuli, right? I'm assuming that most folks have heard of phobias, right? Snake phobias, spider phobias, or arachnophobia. Well, that's a really good example of an individual difference as well. There are some people who, again, talking about horror movies, there are some people who would probably absolutely love this movie, The Shining, but, would they ever want to watch something that stars a snake if they're really afraid of snakes, right? Was there a question? Or you good? All right. And then the why, and this is probably the most important thing for everyone in this theater, is, well, risk-reward situations differ based on the individual. I may want to, it's worth it for me because I'm rewarded by horror movies to risk the slight feelings of fear and the physiological sensations. So that's one part of it. Also, just different motivations and personalities. We know that there's vast differences in how sensation-seeking people are, which we'll talk about in just a second. And I want to make sure I have enough time here. So I have about 20 minutes, right? So I got 5 more minutes? But the other thing I just wanted to bring up quickly is the other basis of fear here is there's a sociocultural aspect as well, right? Because there's a definitional thing. Psychologists, basically, we measure. That's what we're good at. So when we start to measure things, we measure things at the individual difference level and then at the sociocultural level. And one of the things is, well, what about one's particular culture or one particular group that has to do with when it's okay to be afraid, right? And that might influence why people are more or less engaged in activity that raises fear in them. So yeah, and even in some cultures, there's wildly different definitions of what fear is. In some cultures, not typically seen in the U.S., there are some folks who don't define fear as anything cognitive. There's no thought aspect of fear. It's mostly just physiological. And then, of course, we have the kind of other aspect of, well, if I face my fear, then someone else could see me as courageous or brave, and that has pro-social benefits as well. And then finally, of course, to get to the point, there is this, we've built up, societally speaking, some positive things related to fear and horror in the entertainment industry. So here we go. We got all the usual suspects here. Now, I will say something about fear and horror. Fear and horror are not the same thing. Horror is one of those, if you Google horror, usually you come up with horror movies first. It's not necessarily something that we talk about in the context of fear. And I would say that's why they're not called fear movies, because if you really think about it, the fear response as I described it, if you were actually having a full-on fear response during a movie, you probably wouldn't go back to the movies, right? Wouldn't go back to that movie. But we do have many aspects of fear that are implicit in horror. You still get nervous anticipation. You still have a physiological change, usually. And sometimes there's behavioral responses, right? Gripping your chair, covering your eyes, those types of things. One of the techniques that we use in our laboratory to study fear is the startle reflex. I'm assuming that everyone's been waiting for the killer to come out. It's kind of creepy, and then sudden's and then everyone jumps a mile, right? That's actually a well understood neural circuit, the startle reflex circuit, that we use to probe fear. So it's pretty relevant here. So the bottom line, though, is so why are you all here, right? I don't know if I fully have done a good job answering that question. And quite honestly, it's because I don't have a good answer. So when in doubt, this is what I learned in graduate school. When in doubt and you don't have a good answer, skirt around the issue and don't directly address it. That works. But seriously, though, it's just tough because it's an individual difference. Like I mentioned, there's some things we know about the fear system, but there's a lot of things we know about individual differences in people that we can't really isolate and say, this is why. A few hypotheses, and some things we know, we have some evidence for. Sensation seeking, some people like novelty and like the biological response you get. Adrenaline is part of the fear system, right? Adrenaline is part of the fear response. Some people like that surge of adrenaline. It's usually part of the sensation seeking personality type. A lot of folks have an increased sense of mastery or control when watching things that are fearful. There's something called the counterphobic response, wanting to face one's fears. That seems to be consistently an important motivation for many people in many aspects of life. And also, this is a nice controlled situation. Movies usually can't hurt you. So, that's typically a good place for people to act out those counterphobic behaviors. There is so I study anxiety and fear. There's some thought that on the opposite end of the spectrum, those who are fearless to a psychopathic degree, so lacking certain emotions, that this is a socially acceptable way to kind of see pain and violence. That's a little bit different than what I was talking about before. I hope that's none of you. But and then of course, and this is my opinion. This is all that stuff we did before was great. That's the stuff I know about. Now we're venturing into the territory where I don't know anything, about film. I don't know much about film. I watch films, but the stories, right? I would say that there are some stories that can only be told as horror stories, and that makes them more interesting. So the final thing I have for you folks is that, the one consistent finding, unfortunately this is true in most of psychology, but the one consistent finding is that there is no consistency. The why answers are really hard to come by in psychology. It's good because there's a lot of diversity in human experience. But, the why answers, they're tough. They're tough to find. So I would say that you take a little bit of the science that we used or that I discussed, you take your expert knowledge of yourself, because you are indeed the expert of yourself, and there's your answer, right? There's probably something that's relevant to you in there, some that's probably not. But unfortunately, I get to do the cop-out of, well, it's science and where it's iterative, and I can't tell you yet. But that's what I got. So, oh my God, it came out as a GIF. I thought it was a still. Anyway, any questions? That is awful.